Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to read the story of John Henry, an American legend. Now, this story is the last story in our module about the early American West. So before I read it, I wanted to remind you of all the books we've read about the early American West. We started by reading The Buffalo Are Back, and we learned about the Great Plains, and we learned how important the buffalo were to the people of the Great Plains and the health of all the grasslands there. We learned about how in the mid-1800s the settlers came to the Great Plains, and that changed things for the buffalo. There were once 75 million buffalo, and after some years there were only 300 left in the wild. So we also learned about President Theodore Roosevelt's effort to save the buffalo, who now the buffalo are back. We also read an informational text about the Plains Indians. These were the first peoples to live in the Great Plains. We learned about their culture and traditions and some of the struggles with the settlers and the American government that the Plains Indians have had over the years. We also learned about how they've persevered and continued to live in the traditions of their ancestors. We read a story called Journey of a Pioneer, and this was written in the form of a journal, if you remember, of Olivia in 1845, a girl who went west with her family on the Oregon Trail. We also heard as a read aloud the legend of Blue Bonnet, and we learned that a legend is a story that is passed down over generations, sometimes to explain something, and it may or may not be totally true. This legend was the story of a girl who gave something up she sacrificed for the good of all her people, and it's a Comanche story. Her people are called the Comanche people in what is now Texas. We read another legend about a man named John Chapman, who we called Johnny Appleseed. He was born in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s, and he traveled west with the settlers, planting apple trees and being kind to people and animals. And that was the legend of Johnny Appleseed. This one is written by Aliki. We read another story of Johnny Appleseed by Stephen Kellogg that was a tall tale. Now, you might remember a tall tale is a legend that's told with exaggeration. So there were some funny parts of this story that weren't necessarily true. They were a bit exaggerated. So now we're going to go back to John Henry, and this is the last story in our module about the American West. John Henry, Story and Pictures by Ezra Jack Keats. Now this story is a little bit later on our timeline. You might notice that by now, when this man was alive, there was railroads and steam engines and things that were not around in the time of people going west on the Oregon Trail in the mid-1800s. A hush settled over the hills. The sky swirled soundlessly round the moon. The river stopped murmuring, and the wind stopped whispering. The frogs and the owls and the crickets fell silent, all watching and waiting and listening. And then the river roared. The wind whispered and whistled and sang. The frogs croaked, the owls hooted, and all the crickets chirped. "Welcome, welcome," echoed the hills. And John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Bang, 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 rang little John Henry's hammer through the cabin as he crawled about. "What's that rascal up to now?" his mother chuckled, and before she knew it, he was big enough to help her around the house. As he grew up, he did a man's work with his father. One day, John Henry thought, "I'm taller and stronger than anyone around. It's time I went out into the world." He said goodbye to his mother and father, and off he went. He worked on farms and in cotton fields, but all that was too tame. He got himself a job on a riverboat. One stormy night, The ship plowed through the darkness. Suddenly, the big steel rod that turned the paddle wheel broke. The wheel stopped turning. Smash went the rod through the bottom of the ship. "Pump water!" shouted the captain. "Get to the port before we sink." John Henry leapt to the paddle wheel crank. He seized it, pushed, grunted, and pulled. Slowly the giant wheel turned. With all his strength he kept it turning. "Lord Almighty help us," someone whispered in that long dark night. As day broke, they sighted shore and pulled into port. A thunderous cheer went up for John Henry. John Henry felt a new excitement in the air. Men were talking of railroads being built from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They're going to lay those tracks over rivers, across prairies and deserts, and right through mountains, and through Indian lands and stampeding buffalo herds and badlands. "Goodbye, boys," cried John Henry. "I'm going to swing me a hammer on them beautiful new tracks. My hands are just itching to hold a hammer again," John Henry said. He tried one for size and laughed. "Sure does feel fine." He drove those spikes, singing to the clanging of his hammer. The men joined in, their voices singing, hammers ringing, and John Henry's gang was in the lead as day after day the tracks moved steadily westward. Rising across their path was a sprawling mountain range. Its snow-capped peaks reached high into the clouds. We'll have to tunnel through," said his friend Lil Bill. "It'll be awful dangerous. Could be cave-ins," someone put in. "That suits me fine," said John Henry. "Me too," added Lil Bill. "Here's how we'll do it, boys," the foreman called out. A couple of men drove a hole into the rock. Then the powder men will put dynamite into the hole and explode it. The others will cart the loose rock away. We'll do this again and again until we have a tunnel right through this mountain. And it's going to be a real big tunnel, boys. Big enough for a giant locomotive pulling one of them long string of trains. All right, boys, blast away!" Deep into the mountain they worked, as John Henry's singing echoed through the tunnel. The powder men got ready to blast more rock. They filled a hole with dynamite, put in a long fuse, and lit it. "Run, men!" cried the foreman. He's the guy that's in charge. They all scrambled back, ready to dash clear of the blast. At that instant came a great cracking and rumbling, and the entire tunnel trembled around them. "It's a cave-in! We're trapped!" There was no place to run. The fuse burned closer to the dynamite. John Henry was nearest the fuse. He ran to put it out, but tripped and fell. "Ooh, I'm hurt bad," he groaned. "I can't get up." The fuse burned farther out of reach. Others rushed toward it, but they were too far away. Suddenly John Henry remembered. He still had his hammer in his hand. Down came the hammer, smack on the burning tip. There it is, the burning tip. The fuse was out. Danger past. Sighs of relief filled the smoky tunnel. "Woo! Help me up, boys," mumbled John Henry. Clearing their way through the cave-in, the men carried him to safety. Some days later, they heard an unfamiliar clatter. Down the tunnel came a group of men with a strange machine. "This is a steam drill. It can drill more holes faster than any 6 men combined," a new man bragged. "Who can beat that?" John Henry stepped forward. "Try me." He and Lil Bill took their workplaces. John Henry gripped his hammer. Lil Bill clutched his steel drill. "Check the machine," came an order. A nervous hand fell on the switch. In the dark, both sides waited for the signal to start. A hoarse voice counted 1, 2. He's gonna race the steam engine by hand. 3. The machine shrieked as it started. John Henry swung his hammer, and a crash of steel on steel split the air. Clang, bang, clang. The drill got red hot in Lil Bill's hands. He quickly dropped it and picked up another. Hiss, whistle, rattle. Men frantically heaved coal into the hungry, roaring engine and poured water into the steaming boiler. They found a new way to dig holes. Whoop, clang, whoop, bang! John Henry's hammer whistled as he swung it. Chug, chug, clatter rattled the machine. Hour after hour raced by. The machine was ahead. Hand me that 20-pound hammer, Lil Bill. Harder and faster crashed the hammer. Great chunks of rock fell as John Henry ripped hole after hole into the tunnel wall. The machine rattled and whistled and drilled even faster. Friends doused John Henry and Lil Bill with cold water to keep them going. John Henry swung both mighty hammers faster and faster. He moved so fast men could see only a blur and sparks from his striking hammers. His strokes ran out like a great heartbeat. At the other side of the tunnel, the machine shrieked, groaned, and rattled and drilled. Then all at once it shook and shuddered, wheezed, and stopped. Frantically the men worked to get it going again, but they couldn't. It had collapsed. John Henry's hammering still rang and echoed through the tunnel with a strong, steady beat. This guy's a legend. Wow. Suddenly there was a great crash. Light streamed into the dark tunnel. John Henry had broken through. Wild cries of joy burst from the men. Still holding one of his hammers, John Henry stepped out into the glowing light of the dying day. It was the last step he ever took. Even the great heart of John Henry could not bear the strain of his last task. John Henry died with his hammer in his hand. If you listen to the locomotives roaring through the tunnels and across the land, you'll hear them singing of that great steel-driving man, John Henry. Listen. So that is the legend of John Henry. I hope you enjoyed this story, another legend about someone who helped out in the great American West.